My name is Dorinda Evans. I live just north of Jackson, Mississippi, and I am what is called a dedicated quilter. I've been quilting for about 24 years now and have made over 300 quilts. Many times when the word quilts or quilting is mentioned to folks, it recalls memories of visiting Grandma and going in the room to see the quilting frame suspended from the ceiling drop down for all the neighborhood ladies to gather around and quilt together. But the quilting world has definitely changed since then. Quilting is no longer a country craft or something done in country homes. It is now a $4 billion a year industry. And statistics show that 17% of American households are actually involved in quilting. Quilting, as we know it, is closely tied in with the history of the United States. When early European settlers came over, they brought their quilts from Europe. And as they wore out, they had to be patched with pieces of old clothing. So this is where the term patchwork came from. Fabric was very difficult to get in the early history of the United States because it all had to be shipped over from Europe. But once Americans became more self-sufficient by growing their own cotton and weaving their own textiles, then fabric was more readily available to the pioneer women. Back during the push toward the West, little bits of fabric and design patterns were traded off as women met each other and made friends and then separated again to resettle. The names of these blocks are very reflective of their trip. I would like to show you a few traditional blocks that reflect the history of these pioneer women. In front of me is a quilt called the Americana Sampler that was designed by Fons and Porter for the bicentennial years. This is a sampler quilt because there is one block of many different patterns, and in here you will find some traditional blocks. The name of this block right here is called Broken Dishes. So you can imagine how the pioneer women were dismayed that many of their dishes were broken on the trip. The quilt block we find here is named Shoe Fly. You can imagine the insects they had to deal with on their trip. And this block is a very, very traditional block where you trace the quilter's hand, and the symbolism behind this is hands to work, hearts to God. Memories from home were very important, and so this block with the red flowers and the green stems and leaves is called Carolina Lily. Animal tracks often became quilt patterns. The name of this one is called the Bear Paw. Located here is a very traditional log cabin block. In a log cabin block, the centers are traditionally red or yellow to symbolize the hearth or the fireplace in their new log home. The lighter colored logs on one side of the block stand for the good times in life, and the darker strips of fabric on the opposite side stand for those times where life was just a little bit harder. I would like to show you the evolution of a log cabin block from traditional to quite contemporary. This quilt from the 1880s has been passed down through the generations into our family. You can see the use of very thick suiting type fabrics and brocades, but the quilter has put these in a log cabin setting. Here you see the log cabin block with the traditional red fireplace, light logs, and dark logs. This quilter was also just a little bit beyond her time because she did change this log in this position to add more of a square effect. This miniature log cabin quilt, there are 12 blocks here in this quilt, and you see that the little red center is there. There are light logs on one side, dark on the other. When you turn these blocks a certain direction, you get the setting that they call field and furrows, because it looks like the hills and valleys of a freshly plowed field. The quilt behind me was made in 1999 out of my scraps. I began with a log cabin block, but did not treat it very traditionally. The center of the quilt is blocks that are half red, and half orange. And as you move out, each row changes colors. You'll see that this row is orange and yellow. These blocks are yellow-green, green to blue, blue to purple, and then when you get toward the edges of the quilt, the order reverses. These log cabin blocks are placed in what is called a barn raising setting, which looks like a diamond from a distance. This quilt was actually published in the Great American Quilt series as a non-traditional use of a traditional pattern. The fabric behind me is batik. It has been imported from Indonesia. It is a particularly fine quality of cotton. The log cabin is the block that this quilt is based on, but as you can see, instead of the small hearth center, I have put pinwheels. This adds a lot of motion to the quilt. You can see here that the dark strips are weaving their way across the quilt, over and under, as the light and dark sides of the log cabin are turned. Through the years that followed the pioneer expansion, quilts were made for our soldiers during Civil War. Quilts also became album quilts, friendship quilts, where you would make a quilt full of one block only and have a spot for your friends to sign. Quilts that had a center medallion were very popular, but most quilts were utilitarian. There was a fad that came from England called crazy quilts. Now these quilts were made out of velvets and satins, pieces of suits and ribbons, and as you laid these pieces next to each other and opened up the seams, you could fill those seams with very, very fancy embroidery. Many of these quilt tops were not quilted completely through, but remained only a top and were used as a guest bed coverlet. This is why there are so many of them still available today and can be seen in museums all over the country. Many of the fabrics that our grandparents used to make their quilts came from feed sacks. This is where the feed companies would package up feed and flour and sugar and such in sacks that were made of fabric. The one hazard was, though, that the farmer, when he went to town to buy supplies, his wife would always remind him, be sure, check the patterns on the feed sack so that I can have several of the same design and have enough fabric to make a dress. Many of the quilts that you have in your closets, probably inherited from your grandmother, used these fabrics. They are also being reproduced nowadays so that you can recreate those same quilts with new fabrics. The invention of the sewing machine in 1856 began to change the quilting world. More and more quilts were machine pieced, and this is a trend that we still see today. Many people think that a quilt is only a quilt if it is traditionally pieced by hand and quilted by hand. I am of the firm belief, however, that had a pioneer woman had a sewing machine, she would have used it. After the Depression years, quilting faded onto the back burner as we fought World War II. But an interest in quilting began to be revived again for America's bicentennial celebration. That, coupled with one new invention. In 1979, a Japanese garment maker created a brand new tool that has revolutionized garment making and quilting. This tool is called a rotary cutter. It is a circular razor blade which slices through fabric just like a pizza cutter. Before the rotary cutter was created, any designs and patterns had to be traced out on a piece of cardboard, laid on your fabric, traced with a pencil, and cut out by hand with a pair of scissors. This, however, has changed the entire quilting world because when you combine a self-healing mat, a ruler, and the rotary cutter, you can cut many layers of fabric at a time, accurately and quickly. In today's world, there's room for everyone in quilting. Quilting ranges all the way from traditional quilts to art quilts. Most traditional quilters will go back into the historical patterns and use reproduction fabrics to recapture quilts with the feeling of the Civil War or of the 1930s. But the opposite end of the spectrum are art quilters who make smaller pieces to be used as art on the wall. Often these art quilters are not afraid to manipulate and change their fabrics. They will paint them, they will stamp them, they will burn them, they will shred the fabric, they will dye them different colors, and then when they're all put together they will embellish their quilts very often with beads, shells, or anything else they can find in the hardware store that helps them to get their point across for their art statement. The quilts that most people do nowadays, and myself included, is that we find ourselves in between traditional and art quilters in a world that is called contemporary quilting. Our techniques and some of our designs are based in traditional quilting, and we might be artistic in our choice of fabrics, color, and design, but our entire focus is having fun with the new fabrics of today that are brighter and bolder in color, and tweaking traditional patterns and designs to make them have a more geometric feel. If you think you might be interested in quilting, there are many resources available to you, including local guilds and quilt shops. You can check the internet and find all sorts of organizations that would be willing to help you on your quilting journey. Thank you for visiting today, and happy quilting!